I'm Karen Cunningham, and I am just a volunteer. This is a wonderful campus to work with. They have great ideas, and I'm just so happy to be here to introduce our next guest. So this is Kyle Motley, and let me look at my notes. He's the Coastal Community Coordinator with the Elakha Alliance. He's going to give us an in-depth exploration of sea otters, their ecological role, and their historical significance along the Oregon coast. Kyle will share fascinating history of these marine mammals, discuss the vital ecological functions they serve in coastal ecosystems, and outline considerations involved in their potential reintroduction to Oregon. Kyle has an extensive background working with endangered species, threatened ecosystems, stakeholder engagement, and watershed restoration projects on private and public lands. He received his Master's of Science degree in Natural Resources from the University of Vermont, where he focused on forest ecology. There's more in the press release that you may have seen. And let me just ask before we have you stand up to begin, how many found this on Facebook? Just a hand if you saw it on Facebook. How about word of mouth? Is there any other method that you? Email. Email. Oh, okay, that's right. So previous people get the email.
Insider.
Oh, the insider. Excellent. Very good. And one other?
Cy Young book, very collaborative.
Oh, excellent. Good, good, good. Good to know all that, somehow we reach people. Well, Kyle, take it away.
Thanks, everybody. My name is Kyle. I am the Coastal Community Coordinator for the Elakha Alliance, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about sea otters, their history, and some of the work we are doing at the Elakha Alliance to bring them back. Just a quick overview of what I'll cover today. I'll do a little bit about the life history of sea otters, talk about the past and current status of their populations. I'll talk a little bit about the efforts and considerations that go into reintroducing the species to our coast. I'll talk a little bit about our group, the Elakha Alliance, and then I'll have some time for questions and discussion. So this cute guy here is a sea otter. Sea otters are part of the mustelid family, and mustelids are a family of carnivorous mammals that include weasels, skunks, wolverines, and badgers. And there are 3 subspecies of sea otter. There's a northern subspecies, a southern subspecies, and an Asian subspecies. Sea otters live in coastal waters of the Pacific, usually within a half-mile from shore. They tend to be found in areas like rocky shorelines and reefs, and are known to utilize kelp canopies for foraging, resting, and protection from predators. They're very social animals. They congregate in groups called rafts. So a group of wolves is a pack, a group of sea otters is a raft. And sea otters live in the cold waters of the North Pacific, and they spend almost their entire life in the water. But they're the only marine mammal that does not use blubber to stay warm. Instead, they have the densest fur of any animal in the world. They have 1 million hairs per square inch. And I brought my sea otter pelts that you guys can feel how soft it is and all the hair. And you also get an idea of how big they are. I'm 5'10". And this is a young male from Washington that is almost as tall as I am. So I'm gonna have someone walk around and you guys can feel the fur. Another way that they stay warm is they have an extremely high metabolism. They eat about 30% of their body weight every day, which is the equivalent to me eating about 50 pounds of food every day. So between the fur and the high metabolism, they're able to stay warm without blubber in the ocean. And in order to feed so much, they're very efficient divers and foragers, often feeding on urchins, crabs, clams, and other shellfish. They can dive pretty deep, up to about 250 feet. That is very taxing on the animal. Most sea otter dive events are done under 60 feet, so they can get the most calories and for the least amount of effort. And it's easy to see what sea otters like to eat because they carry all of their food to the surface. Like humans and chimpanzees, they're one of the only animals to use tools. They often have favorite rocks that they'll put on their belly to smash open shellfish on, like an anvil, like the guy up there in the top picture. They also have extremely strong jaws. They have the same bite force as a black bear in this animal, and they have fracture-resistant teeth so they can crunch through shells without breaking any teeth. Yeah, I wish I had. We're gonna have to go to the dentist if I had fracture-resistant teeth. I love this photo. Sea otters are a very slow breeding species. They have about one pup at a time, and pups are dependent on the mother for about up to a year. They nurse for 6 months, and then mother sea otters teach their young how to dive and forage over the next 6 months. They're often seen holding their pups and cleaning them, or wrapping themselves and their pups in kelp to avoid drifting apart during storms. I did a sea otter tour up in Alaska, and there were a bunch of moms with pups there. And sea otter pups are so buoyant that they physically can't go underwater, so they just float on the water like corks while the moms dive down to get food. It's very cute. And sea otters are the smallest marine mammal, but they can still get pretty big. They can be up to about 80 pounds or the size of a German Shepherd. In context and contrast, harbor seals, which we see a lot of here on the Oregon coast, can be about 350 pounds, and that is mostly because of the mass amount of blubber that they use to stay warm in the ocean. And sea otters are 3 times larger than river otters, which is an important distinction because it's very easy for people to mistake the two. And so I like to include this slide just shows some of the differences. So sea otters are a lot bigger. Sea otters are very buoyant and they swim on their backs, whereas river otters are not as buoyant and they swim on their belly. Sea otters, their rear feet are actually flippers that help propel themselves in the water, whereas river otters, all of their feet are small paws. Sea otters have 1 pup at a time, river otters have multiple pups at a time. And once sea otters were here in Oregon, they used to range across the entire North Pacific, from Baja, California, up the coast of North America, into Russia, across the Aleutian Islands, into Russia, and even northern Japan. It's estimated that there were around 200,000 animals in this population worldwide. How many we had here in Oregon, we're not sure, but some modeling and some recent data suggests that there's probably around 4,000 across the entire state. And how do we know that sea otters were here in Oregon? One of the ways is that every coastal indigenous language has its own word for sea otter. We take our name, the Elakha Alliance, from the Chinook word Elakha, which means sea otter in that language. We also know that sea otters were here because of the stories passed down from tribal people. Sea otter pelts held a very special role in their societies. They were often precious items conferring wealth and status to the wearer. And there are a lot of traditional narratives that have been passed down about otter skins being a prize for protagonists in stories. Now, in some parts of the coast, there are traditional narratives that inform us that sea otters were viewed as respected kin and really linked to the natural cycles that brought people food and prosperity. We also know they were here from the accounts of early white settlers. The first American ship in the Columbia, captained by Robert Gray, sent back many reports about beaver skins and otter pelts. There's this article published in the Willamette Farmer about sea otters being hunted off of Port Orford, and then a really interesting article published in 1855 in the Harper's Bazaar, which tells of the author going on a sea otter hunting expedition in Coos Bay, Oregon. And lastly, we have places on the coast named for sea otters passed down from tribal languages into English, like Otter Rock in Lincoln County and then Otter Point here in Curry County. So we know that sea otters are here. How do we have any idea about how abundant they were in Oregon? The only real evidence we have is the archaeological evidence. Sea otter bones are the second most numerous marine mammal bone found in shell middens at ancient village sites. And it's really showed that Oregon was the transition zone of the northern subspecies and the southern subspecies, and provided a really important genetic link between those two populations. So sea otters were here. We kind of know that. What happened to them? Beginning in the mid-1700s, sea otters were aggressively hunted throughout their range for their rich fur pelts in the maritime fur trade. The first time I touched a sea otter pelt, I kind of understood, right? Like, it's sad, but you kind of get why they were hunted so much. It was mostly Russian, British, and American ships hunting sea otters, often sadly using forced labor of local indigenous peoples to hunt them. And they were selling most of those pelts to China, where they were used as a sign of power by royalty in the upper class. There was intense hunting pressure across their range until it eventually petered out in the 19th century because they had been hunted so extensively that it was no longer profitable to hunt them. Oregon was not really a prime target of the fur trade. If you know the Oregon coast, we have few large natural harbors. The sea otter populations were likely dispersed, but it was a very lucrative trade though. It's thought that one sea otter pelt in the 1800s was worth about $15,000 in today's money. So the Russians call it brown gold. They made a lot of money off of sea otter pelts. As I said, sea otters were scarce by the mid-1800s. They gained protection with the International Fur Seal Treaty of 1911, but by then hunting had all but ceased because sea otters had become so rare it was no longer profitable to actually hunt them. I mean, it's thought that they were eliminated from Oregon entirely by the early 1900s. The last evidence I've seen of a native Oregon sea otter is this article published in the Coos Bay Times in 1910, which tells of a Mr. George Forty buying an otter pelt from a man named S.C. Brown who shot it in Port Orford. And he bought that for $500 in 1910. And even though there was extensive hunting with the fur trade, and it was extensive, 99% of sea otters around the world were killed in the fur trade. 13 populations did survive. You can see that most of these are in pretty isolated places in Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, the Kamchatka Peninsula of Russia. Somehow, 50 animals survived in Big Sur, California, which must have been isolated enough from local populations. And those animals were able to survive the fur trade, but they were the only animals south of the Aleutian Islands that actually survived the fur trade. And we at the Elakha Alliance are happy that those populations did survive because it has really provided the basis for the revival of the species. And I would just want to go back to from this in the early 1900s to this where we are now. So it has been a real revival of the species, but you could see that Oregon is right in the middle of about a 900-mile gap between otters in California and otters in Washington right now. So where could you find sea otters today in the US? California has sea otters. They have the southern subspecies. They range from about Santa Cruz in the north to Point Conception in the south, or about 300 miles of the California coast. There are about 3,000 animals in this population, which might seem like a lot, but that's only about 13% of their original range in the state. And they're being stopped from spreading both north and south by shark bites. Great white sharks don't eat sea otters. They're looking for that blubber from seals and other marine mammals. But I'm a surfer, like they do to surfers. They do a little exploratory bite. That is often fatal to the animal. There are huge concerns about the genetic limitations of these animals. Every animal in this population descended from that original 50 in Big Sur. So they went through a very tight genetic bottleneck. They're all kind of related to each other, and there's no genetic input from otters in the north because there's about a 900-mile gap between those populations. You could find sea otters in Washington. This is the northern subspecies of sea otter. They were reintroduced to the Olympic Peninsula in the 1970s, and there are currently about 3,000 animals there now. There are major concerns about what oil spills might do to this population. If anyone saw any of the photos from the Exxon Valdez spill, sea otters, when they're come in contact with oil, their fur gets coated with it, they can't clean it, and they die of hypothermia. Alaska also has the northern subspecies of sea otters. Sea otters were nearly extinct in Southeast Alaska by the mid-1800s, but in the 1960s, 450 otters were reintroduced to this area. And this population has grown to almost 30,000 animals now. And this is just due to the high carrying capacity of the area. When you think of Southeast Alaska, you think of islands, fjords. It's this complex geographic habitat that otters can spread in all directions. It's really been a huge success story in the conservation of the species, but it has led to some human use conflicts in the area. So you can imagine what 30,000 sea otters eating 30% of their body weight every day could do to certain shellfish that people eat and make a living off of. Interestingly enough, there was a reintroduction effort in Oregon in the 1970s as well. 50 animals were brought to Port Orford and 40 were brought to Coos Bay. 11 pups were born over the course of 6 years, but this population ultimately petered out. We've kind of looked into this. Why did the Oregon reintroduction not work? All of these reintroductions were done very opportunistically. There was atomic bomb testing being done on an Aleutian island. They were required to get those sea otters out of that area. So they kind of just took sea otters and put them in places. They put them in Washington, British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, Oregon, what they found was that immediately, if you put 100 animals in the water, half leave. They want to go back to where they're from. And so with 50 in Port Orford and 40 in Coos Bay, those populations became so small that they really couldn't sustain themselves. They also encountered some really bad weather when they were doing this. They had to dump otters into open water because they couldn't make it to the actual release sites. So we are working to make sure that there's better methods and better science-based tactics for actually reintroducing sea otters in the future if it were to happen. And while there are no native sea otters here in Oregon, we do occasionally still see them. They are almost always young males coming down from the Washington population to look for mates on the Oregon coast unsuccessfully, which is what my current dating experience is like on the coast as well. It is rough out there. And so I feel for all of these young guys out there. But yeah, there was one in Newport in 2021, another in Reedsport in 2016, and then one in Depot Bay in 2009. And if you guys paid attention to the news last summer, there was 2 sea otters on North Coast at Elakha State Park. See if I can get this video to play. Oh, that's loud. So I'll try to scream over this. We get a lot of calls from people saying that they think they saw a sea otter. 99% of the time they're river otters. This person was adamant, no, it had rear flippers. It was swimming on its back. So my coworker drove down to the North Coast, spent an entire day looking for them, and this is the video she took. So one is hauled out here on the rock, the other is periscoping in the water, looking for threats, and they hung around for about a month before one of them disappeared and one washed up with the shark bite, which is what usually happens to the young males who come down. Yeah. And it was really just amazing to see, because the amount of times that I hear, oh, I saw a sea otter, it's a river otter, to actually go out and see 2 there was very cool. But why do we care if sea otters are here or if they aren't? One of the big reasons is that they're a keystone species. And a keystone species is one that significantly and disproportionately affects the structure and function of its surrounding ecological environment. So they're like beavers. What do beavers do? They build dams. A dam floods an area, influences what type of plants grow there, influences what type of animals live on those plants, influences what type of animals eat those animals that live on those plants. Similarly with wolves. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, they started preying on elk. The elk no longer congregated around the rivers, stopped eating all the willows and the trees. Those trees grew back. They shaded the streams, the water cooled down, native fish returned, songbirds returned. So these animals had these huge impacts on their environment through that kind of top-down predation. And sea otters were really the animal that exemplified the idea of a keystone species. And it was shown through some graduate work done in 1970s by a man named Jim Estes. While Jim was diving off of Amchitka Island, where there was a very healthy population of sea otters, what Jim saw was this picture on the left, this dense, beautiful kelp forest with all the invertebrates, fish, and mammals that use that kelp. While diving off of nearby Shemya Island, where there were no sea otters, what he saw was instead this picture on the right, which is an urchin barren. So the idea here being that sea otters prey on urchins, limit the urchin populations so they don't get out of hand and devour all of the kelp. So sea otters, like wolves, through that top-down predation, are able to let kelp grow and provide habitat and food for all those other species. And why do we care about kelp? And it's really an amazing plant. Well, it's not a plant, it's algae, but it's whatever. It's an amazing, amazing species. It creates complex habitat. It's really the foundation of our nearshore ecosystem. It's associated with large amounts of biodiversity. It buffers ocean waves and currents and stops coastal erosion, and also captures and stores carbon and is thought to be instrumental in a fight against climate change. We mostly have bull kelp here in Oregon, which grows annually. California has giant kelp and bull kelp, which grows perennially. But there is one spot in Oregon where you can find giant kelp, and it's Simpson Reef up in Coos Bay. I don't know why, but it's there. I've went through too many presentations in grad school that had a lot of data, so I promise this is not going to go into data. Just there is decades of science that show the foundational effects that sea otters have on kelp and how that kelp helps other species. This is some data from a study on Vancouver Island that just shows as sea otters came into an area, the increase in kelp over 5 years and 20 years, and then the increase in the species that use kelp. And similarly, they found that there were 46 times more rockfish in areas with sea otters just because of that increase in kelp canopy. And sea otters have also been shown to have huge benefits to our estuaries as well. There's been a loss of eelgrass beds across the Pacific, well, across the world, but particularly bad in the Pacific. In an elkhorn slough in California, sea otter reintroductions into that estuary have been shown to increase the health and cover of eelgrass. The idea here is similar to the urchin and kelp example. There are slugs and snails that graze on algae that grow on eelgrass, and that helps keep that eelgrass clean and able to photosynthesize and breathe. But without predators like sea otters, small crab populations increase. They devour all those algae grazers, and eelgrass starts to suffocate. So the reintroduction of sea otters allowed them to limit those crabs and increase that eelgrass cover as well. And there's been some recent papers that show that sea otters in Elkhorn Slough are also eating invasive green crab at about 120,000 a year in that estuary. And invasive green crab has become a problem in a lot of our larger estuaries here in Oregon. And eelgrass, like kelp, is an amazing habitat. It improves water quality. It increases biological productivity of our estuarine systems. It has amazing habitat for salmon, crab, other fish, and migratory waterfowl as well. And why is this all important? You know, we have a changing ocean with real threats. And right now, kelp forests in Oregon and California are being decimated by an increase of purple sea urchins. And these are some sensational headlines that I found. Sea urchin army is mowing down California's kelp forests. My favorite is that California's underwater forests are being eaten by the cockroaches of the ocean. And yeah. And you know, this is all California focused, but it is happening right here in our backyard as well. This is a photo on the left of Orford Reef in Port Orford in 2016. Shows this beautiful, murky, dense kelp forest. 2 years later, same spot. What you're looking at is an urchin barren. It's really easy to demonize purple urchins, but they are a native species here. But in a healthy ecosystem with predators, urchins live in cracks and crevices and they hide, and they eat bits of kelp that break off and drip down to them. But without predators, their populations grow quickly and they can devour entire kelp forests. And they don't just move into an area, eat kelp and leave. They can survive in a so-called zombie state for up to a decade, like digesting their own innards, waiting for more kelp to come back. In Orford Reef in Port Orford, which used to have one of Oregon's densest kelp forests, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Service just did a dive down there. And instead of kelp, they're estimating that there are 350 million purple urchins, and that's one reef in Oregon. So yeah, the Pacific Coast in general is facing a changing ocean, and we're seeing dramatic losses of our kelp beds. A main issue is the absence of predators. It's not just sea otters. There's been a drastic decline in sunflower sea stars as well. Sunflower sea stars eat purple urchins, but their population crashed in 2014 due to a wasting disease. They estimate that over 99% of sunflower sea stars along the coast had died. They have started to come back a little bit. I know some researchers who are starting to find them in Coos Bay and Uquinna Bay. There's also marine heat waves, warming ocean temperatures that is devastating our kelp. So there's a lot going on out there. And it's why we at the Elakha Alliance are trying to focus in on one possible solution to some of these issues. We get the question a lot, why sea otters, why now? We feel that sea otters are key in helping to restore our ecosystem function. Again, they're a keystone species, so they have that foundational effect on their nearby ecosystems. because they're key predators of urchins, which left out of check can really decimate our forests, our kelp forests, and other seaweeds. And we were started in the late 1990s by a Siletz tribal member named David Hatch. He built a boat with his son Peter. He was looking for a name for that boat, and he found the word Elakha in the Chinook language dictionary, which means sea otter in that language. And that really sparked Dave's interest into why aren't sea otters here, what happened, and what could be done to bring them back. Unfortunately, Dave passed away in 2016, but a small group of people who he had met with to talk about his vision came together to make the Elakha Alliance a reality. We are currently led by a 15-person board of directors who bring years of science, policy, and legal work. And we also have an advisory council who help kind of guide the work that we do in the day-to-day. And our mission as an organization is to restore a healthy population of sea otters along the Oregon coast, and in the process, help make Oregon's marine ecosystem more robust and more resilient. And this deliberately includes a broader ecosystem theme because we don't think sea otters are a silver bullet. We think they're part of a solution for some of the problems that we're facing on the Oregon coast. And the two main objectives that we have for the work that we do is completing the scientific assessment and policy analysis just to determine the feasibility of reintroducing sea otters to Oregon. A lot of the work that I do is building regional consensus that restoring sea otters to Oregon is an actual goal worth pursuing. And only if we are successful in those two objectives would we proceed with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or other government agencies to actually restore sea otters in carefully chosen sites. We've done a lot of work leading up to this. And again, this is on the ground level. There has been no actual decision made. It is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service process, but we're working to build the Oregon-specific science and outreach to get that done. And in doing that, we completed a feasibility study in 2022, which just asked the question of 6 of the world's leading otter ecologists, is it feasible to bring sea otters to Oregon? The answer was yes, it is. There's habitat, there's food for them. The real problems come in, or the real issues come in with the socioeconomic and public perceptions part of it. We've done various economic assessments and GIS assessments. I'm helping Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife amend the nearshore conservation strategy to include sea otters as a priority species. And we've also done a study on the impacts that sea otters might have to the tourism economies on the coast. And the bottom line from some of the work that we have done already, reintroductions are a successful conservation tool. Reintroductions are the reason that 70% of sea otters are around today. It worked in Alaska, it worked in British Columbia, it worked in Washington, and it's likely to succeed in Oregon with appropriate considerations. And those considerations are really the social, economic, and regulatory issues around a reintroduction effort. We think the return of sea otters will have many direct and indirect effects, and we're working with scientists to try to figure some of those out. And again, estuaries may be an important reintroduction environment, as we saw in Elkhorn Slough. And just some of the considerations that go into building a plan to reintroduce sea otters to the Oregon coast, there's the regulatory protections. Sea otters in California, the southern subspecies, are on the endangered species list, but all sea otters are protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act. There's the habitat and site selection. Where would you actually put sea otters to ecologically have a successful reintroduction? And we're working to build a new model that's going to take habitat, food, water quality, population dynamics to really narrow down what parts of the Oregon coast might be the most feasible for a reintroduction effort. There's the source animals. Would you take animals from California and bring them up, or Alaska and bring them down, or both, considering that Oregon historically had both subspecies? There's the fisheries and other socioeconomic impacts. Sea otters eat what we like to eat. Sea otters eat what people make money off of. And how would a sea otter reintroduction actually impact some fisheries on the coast? I'm working with that new model to build some maps of reintroduction efforts to forecast it 15, 30, 50 years in the future to give people in the fishing industry a better idea of what a reintroduction might look like and how it might overlap with their own fisheries. There's the health, behavior, and welfare of any animal that is caught and brought down to another area, and we have a team of scientists working on that. And then there's just the management capacity and support facilities. Bringing 150 animals from one area to another and reintroducing them is a huge undertaking. And the facilities needed for that aren't really here in Oregon. The Oregon Coast Aquarium is, expanding their marine mammal stranding program and is including some facilities that might be able to help us in that work. And lastly, there's the stakeholder concerns and perspectives. I do a lot of outreach to people on the coast like you all. I talk a lot to fishermen and seafood processors, but everybody in Oregon has a stake in this and needs to have their voice heard. Just lastly, we are always looking to collaborate with new partners, especially in the regional scale in Northern California and Oregon. We're always trying to refine and increase our public outreach and community engagement. So thank you all for having me here. We're doing a lot of work to fill some of the gaps that we found through our feasibility study in both the science and socioeconomic and policy stuff. We're working more to do some outreach to fishing communities. And we're always looking to increase our tribal engagement. And we're working right now with the Siletz tribe to build an actual reintroduction management framework. My coworker has a great social media presence. I don't have social media, but if you're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, any of that, she has good stuff. We have a newsletter that goes out once a month, which is great information about our work. And we do events all across Oregon. We do a yearly science symposium that's virtual. My coworker puts on the Oregon Otter Beer Festival in Portland, which brings together about 16 different breweries who all brew an otter-themed beer to see who is the best. It's a really fun event. I'm glad I get to go up for it. And we do a lot of webinars, presentations, event tabling. I tabled at the Azalea Festival down here a couple weeks ago. Had a lot of good conversations. And lastly, an alliance is all about partnerships, and we are grateful for all the agency, conservation, and nonprofit partners who make our work possible. It's a real collaborative effort. And with that, I can take any questions.
Where are you physically headquartered?
We're a full remote organization. So I live in Coos Bay, so I do coastal communication. My coworker and boss live in Portland, and then we have someone in Eugene as well. Yep.
Are you aware of the marine mammal over what Carson said? So you talk a bit about any?
Yeah, a little bit. So, reintroduction through the lens of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is looked regionally. It would be possibly a reintroduction in Northern California and one in Oregon. So there's a regional network of partners who are working on this together. And I think they're involved in the animal welfare subgroup. But I could be wrong on that. I don't attend those meetings.
Have there been otter sightings in the area?
Here? Yeah. Not that I know of. The furthest one that I have, a sea otter just washed up in Bullards Beach in Bandon a couple months ago, which is the furthest south I have heard of a sea otter stranding or sighting.
They're like huge. So if you were down on the beach and you did see like an otter and was in another sea otter.
Yeah, but it's hard, right? Because river otters, they can get pretty long, and they will go onto the beach. They will swim in the near shore hunting for fish. And so it's pretty common for people to be on the beach and see a river otter.
I seen a huge otter on Mill Beach.
Was it in the water or on land?
It was on land.
Okay, then it was almost definitely a river otter.
Okay.
And if you ever see, if river otters on land are very graceful, they're very fast. Sea otters don't have the hip bones to walk because they spend like all of their time in the water. So they kind of like slink like a slug. So yeah, if it was fast and graceful, it was not a sea otter. Yeah.
Just a second.
Where do you think you're going to get the otters from to gray deer?
That's a great question. So there's a couple different thoughts. One is that because sea otters in California are on the endangered species list, there's more funding and more of a push to take those animals and bring them up here because that would help with the recovery of that subspecies. But there's also a larger legislative and legal hurdle because of those extra protections from the Endangered Species Act. Otters in Alaska, there are so many of them, right, that it'd be easy to bring them down. But if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is the one to do this, the stance I have heard is that there's no money in recovery of a non-threatened species. And those otters in Alaska are not threatened, if that makes sense.
Do they also have that family bond that they want to stay with,
Yeah, so there's
taking them away?
work being done, like if you were to do a wild caught reintroduction, would you try to catch a raft? Like, would you try to get all of them in the same group and bring them down? There hasn't been much research on that. The one thing that does seem to work really well is Monterey Bay Aquarium has a stranding program, right? So they take in these pups that are stranded. If they're too young, they feed them what they call the Darth Vader suit, so they don't associate with humans. And then they have some females in the aquarium raise them. When they reintroduce those pups back into the wild, there is no like emigration. They stay where they are. The Elkhorn Slough example that I talked about, most of those are pups from Monterey Bay Aquarium. So the current thinking is it might be a combination of wild caught animals and surrogate raised pups to kind of stop from that immediately. Yeah.
Except for Judge.
What's that?
Except for Judge, the old otter that they had up there.
Oh yeah.
They reintroduced him like 3 or 4 times. He found his way back to Monterey.
Yep. And yeah, there's as a surfer, I love Otter 841. Have you guys heard about Otter 841? They took in her mom at Monterey Bay Aquarium, not knowing she was pregnant. So she gave birth to Otter 841, and they were always Otter 841 in Santa Cruz. And somehow the like predisposition to humans somehow passed through because she's been climbing onto people's surfboards and chewing on the foam on the surfboards. Yeah. And it became such a problem that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has tried to capture her several times.
Take her someplace else.
Yeah, they'll hide the boat behind a rock and they'll put a decoy surfer out there on a board. And sure enough, she climbs on the board, kicks the surfer off, starts chewing on it, but every time they've swooped in to try and grab her, she's disappeared. So she's still out there terrorizing surfers in Santa Cruz. Yeah.
I just know used to be the interpretive officer to Oregon State Parks here at your speech, and I wish I'd had you on my list for pilgrims. But I noticed you didn't have the state parks on your logos there. Before COVID, we had a really strong interpreter program.
Yeah.
So
It's
suggest you get in touch with them because they make contact with.
And I am with the like Sunset Bay office in Coos Bay. I do a lot of presentations out there, and I think where, like you're right, where the rubber is really going to hit the road in any reintroduction is the interpretation. And one of the things that I've always thought about is there's so many signs and beautiful information along the coast, but there's not many that like talk about like what's missing on the coast, and. Yeah, I do think state parks is coming to the table with some of it. And I know a lot of people. Coos Bay is a small community, so I know most of the people who work there, but I would love to expand our partnership with state parks for sure.
I think their interpretive program is beginning to recover.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, COVID did a lot to a lot of organizations, for sure. Yeah.
Can you speak at all to the discoveries you made, the tourism impact?
Yes. So, sorry, my throat's dry. There are a lot of places in the U.S., in British Columbia, where sea otters drive tourism. People go to an area to see sea otters. I did when I was in Alaska. I paid for a boat to go out and see sea otters. And those people who are doing that, they also spend money in restaurants. They spend money in hotels. And so we did a comparative study looking at places in Alaska, California, and Newport, Oregon, because of the sea otters in the aquarium, and looked at like what that might actually bring in economically to some communities in the South Coast. And through some wand wavy modeling magic that I don't really know because I'm not a modeler, it said that it could bring up to about 2.5 million per year into the South Coast, which is not a lot in the big scheme of things, but it is a boon for places that are transitioning to a tourism economy in the process right now. So yeah, it's kind of, I don't know how, I think one of the takeaways was that the South Coast would really need to capitalize on those opportunities. Like there aren't a lot of tour companies in our communities. There's some, but to actually capitalize on sea otters as a way to drive economic development in the coast, you would also have to input money into making that development for those businesses as well.
I don't have a question, but I point something out. They apparently have a genetic memory. I used to do some sea kayaking in Alaska. And if you're on a tour boat or a cruise ship or something, you can get within 5 feet of it. They actually seem curious. But if you're on a kayak 50 yards, you're lucky. They maybe remember somehow.
Yeah, they're smart animals. Yeah. And like Otter 841 on all those surfboards, you know, she's associating something there. Yeah. Yeah.
Do the sea otters prefer places where like rivers come into the ocean, or does that not matter?
So it depends. There are sea otters in Alaska who spend all their time like hundreds of miles off the coast. Not hundreds, but like miles off the coast. There are sea otters who will stay in the near shore and go into estuaries during like high wind events or high storm events. The otters in Elkhorn Slough in California live permanently in that estuary. I would say that historically, the denser kelp beds have been at the openings of river mouths. Not so much anymore because of the loss of kelp we had. So in that way, yes, maybe, but that would be where a lot of nutrients are going into the ocean, where there's probably going to be a little more productivity, maybe some more food for them. But yeah.
A while back, there was incidents of orcas attacking rafts. Is that still going on?
There is one spot in Alaska where orcas are preying on sea otters. It's the only known area where that happens. So much so that sea otters no longer hang out in the ocean. That population is just in a lagoon. And it's not really known why orcas switched to sea otters in that location, but nowhere else have there really been documented orca attacks on sea otters.
Is it during pumping season?
No, I heard some, and I'm gonna butcher this, but I'll try it.
The transient orcas will follow different herds. It's usually not the residential.
Yeah. I know that there is this theory that because of like protections to certain whale species, those whales have been like outplacing other smaller marine mammals that orcas feed off of. So now those orcas have switched to sea otters. But I think all of that's pretty hand wavy. I haven't seen any data on anything about why that population of orcas has started to eat sea otters.
I thought they didn't like them because they don't have the blubber.
They don't, but I think the idea, the reason that people think about that, like the limited part of the smaller marine mammals, is that if they're not able to get that blubber, then maybe they have switched to sea otters for that. Because I imagine sea otters would still be some caloric intake, but why there's been that switch from that population, I don't know, and I haven't seen anybody who actually does know.
Wonder if they're easier to get to,
Maybe.
not as fast as the seals.
I mean, they're underwater, they're very fast. If you ever go to the Newport Aquarium and see them during feeding time, they're going nuts.
I've seen it in Monterey.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah,
amazing waters.
yeah.
Is the South Coast particularly well suited for rearing up?
That historically, that has been the main focus. It's because it's where most of the bull kelp is still left in Oregon, and you know it's rocky. There's reefs, so most of the ideas have been like Coos Bay south. A lot of it has been focused on Port Orford, but with that huge loss of kelp, not so much anymore. The thinking has kind of changed once we've seen how great the otters did in Elkhorn Slough. And it's like maybe estuaries might be an easier or more beneficial place to reintroduce them. And when that comes up, then there are some larger estuaries on the North Coast who look like possible candidates. But I would say that mostly it's focused on South Coast, and you can include like Yaquina Bay, Newport area as well.
I was gonna, like, you kind of touched on that. I was gonna ask whether the otters, do they like urchins, or would they rather get clams and crabs?
They're going for what is the highest calorie for like lowest effort. So like red urchins, they love big red urchins. And you know, one of the reasons that we talk about sea otters not being a silver bullet, right, is because a lot of our former kelp forests are now urchin barrens with like zombie urchins. So those urchins have been eating their own gonads for years now. And so sea otters aren't preferentially going after zombie urchins. They're going after ones with a high gonad intensity. They eat like 113 different species, and it switches based on like what's available, how deep that food is. But it's a lot of urchins, it's a lot of crabs, it's a lot of clams. Abalone is a big one when they can find it. We don't have a lot of abalone here in Oregon. But yeah, I was in Elkhorn Slough doing a kayak survey, and I saw about 50 otters just diving down and coming back up with these bay worms. And they were just eating them like Laffy Taffy, just like pulling them apart. And that's the only thing I saw them eat the entire day was bay worms. So I think it's about what's available and what's easiest for them to die for.
Do they feed lamprey?
Yeah. No, not that I know of. I don't think so.
I know that there's a group out of the Bay Area in California that the divers are going down and grabbing the purple urchins. So when the sea otters go for these urchins, are they going for I'm gonna mess up the word for it, the little purple things that come out?
Spines?
The spine?
No. So
They don't. I tend to find the shells.
yeah, the test. So when you eat uni in a restaurant, what you're eating is sea urchin gonad. That's what sea otters are going for, the innards. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're cracking them open and slurping them out.
People say in this room is a help further your mission.
I love that question. Talk to your elected representatives, whether it's county, city, state, especially federal. I know they're all hearing a lot from a lot of different people right now, but like people who are in position to help make these decisions legislatively need to hear from constituents who support it. So writing people, emailing, calling, that is the most you can do. I could also say donate to our organization. You know, we love donations, but talking to your elected officials right now is probably the biggest push for us.
You guys have,
We do, yeah.
so
Yeah.
I follow it, and that's another good option to say.
And like I live on the coast. I love doing stuff like this. So any other places that need presenters, if you have an event that you want someone to table at, I can bring my tabling kit. So any increased outreach we can get, especially to coastal communities, is very important as well.
That Oregon State Interpretive Program, is there a Curry County representative or is it just Coastback?
Sorry, say it again?
The organization he was talking about, the Oregon State Interpretive Organization?
For state parks?
Yes.
I'm not sure. I know that there is a volunteer group. I forget what they're called. Do you know the volunteer group that does? They do go back to Simpson Reef and Coos Bay and have the spotting scope. Yeah, yeah.
Well, they're usually just volunteers.
Yeah,
We have a extensive volunteer program at state parks.
I think they might have started an actual like non-profit though.
Yeah, there's a bunch of organizations, but like I say, since I retired 4 years ago. COVID really kind of decimated the interpretive program, and which was really sad. So this really beginning to take hold in UL. And I just heard that Harris Beach is starting your programs back up again. So I'd highly recommend that if you're in touch with people of Sunset, to say, hey, I'm willing to go down to Brookie.
Yeah.
You know, because like I say, I wish I'd had you on that program.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'll reach out. Yeah, because I've been doing a lot of presentations at Sunset Bay because they have that little like amphitheater. But would love to come down and do more in this area.
Constantly, I saw sea otters. No, unfortunately, I'm sorry, you did.
Yeah, at the Azalea Festival, I had a bunch of cards that just listed the difference between them, and I was just handing them out. Probably gave out like 100 of them.
You work with the local watersheds?
A little bit, yeah. You know, I think there's a lot of groups now that are trying to like do the like ridge to reef connection. You know, it's all connected, right? What comes in go from the headwaters to the ocean and back, salmon, lamprey, all that. And I used to work at the Coquille Watershed Association, so I also like know most of the people on the South Coast and watersheds. But yeah, I think there is more of a concerted effort to not just like silo ourselves when it comes to work. So yeah, a little bit.
So what would you want the elected officials to do if we got their attention?
I mean, I think just hearing from people who support it, right? Like, I think no one is going to, because it's an expensive process, right? Capturing 100 to 150 animals from an area, bringing them down and reintroducing them, and that doesn't even include the monitoring that has to be done before and after, all of that. Like, it's an expensive process, and I don't know, I'm not a politician, but I don't know many politicians who I feel like are willing to put their necks on the line for a large process without hearing from their constituents that they support it. So just, I think, having voices in their area saying that you want to see it happen, you support it, you think it's a good idea, like that for us is a win. Because then when there is a formal process to move forward, or there is like a legislative bill that's passed and that like maybe Elakha does or one of our tribal partners do, if those elected officials have already heard voices, then that, I think, makes it an easier sell in that way.
And also bringing up that whole tourism aspect.
Yes, yeah.
It's beyond the environmental, rejuvenation, that it could bring money into our area.
Exactly, yeah.
That officials like to.
Yes, for sure, for sure.
And then leveraging off the larger theme of healthy ecosystems up in the Elakha Coast, you see them pouring gazillions into salmon restoration. If we could sort of hook into that larger theme, that might help.
Yeah, because juvenile salmon use kelp bars, right? Rockfish use kelp bars. A lot of our fisheries in Oregon that have a huge economic output are kind of dependent on kelp bars. And so, yeah, I think for me, ecology and economics are way more intrinsically kind of tied together than I initially thought when I was younger. And the more we can do to, I think, is restore and help protect our nearshore environment, the more that the economies on the South Coast stand to gain. And I think elected officials could, I don't think they're viewing it that way, right? But if we can make the case to them, then for sure.
I know it's kind of a broad brush and a fair rail, but what about, do you guys deal with climate change issues on repopulating the CR?
Yeah, I mean, there's like, a lot of people try, like there's this idea that people call sea otters climate change warriors. And that is based on the fact that kelp can sequester huge amounts of carbon. And so sea otters are bringing kelp back, are restoring kelp, then we stand to gain some carbon sequestration. As far as climate change goes for like how it might affect sea otters, it'd probably be like the loss of kelp and warming ocean temperatures. Even though sea otters can stand warmer temperatures, like there's a native population in Baja California. So I think they could probably handle some of that. But yeah, I mean, sea otters can help in our fight against climate change.
I'm also thinking of charismatic individuals. You're talking about surfboard chewer. Yeah, you probably all read about Grizzly 399 in Yellowstone. It's like if we really went after the surfboard chewer and turned it into he just say sea otter in reintroduction. Look, hey, sage the surf for you. What was the number, sorry?
Otter 841? Yeah.
Big and make, just as an example everyone could relate to as an example.
For sure. And I think it helps that like sea otters are charismatic megafauna. Like, I think it kind of sucks that most money goes towards if I was here talking to you guys about reintroducing earthworms, I don't even know if I could do that. Earthworms, Oregon coast. I don't think I have the crowd here I have today, right? So like the fact that they are cute, that people kind of align with them, like that does really help the cause. Absolutely. Yeah.
You kind of hit the magic word there, money.
Yeah.
And by appealing to people through how cute potters are and all that kind of stuff. We did studies or surveys at parks, and found that the average family that stays at the campground spends something on the order of a couple $100.
Well,
Yeah.
so that's how you feel she will bring these things back in forfeit.
Yeah, especially these like small coastal communities, right? That, have seen like the decrease in logging, decrease in port activities. Like how do you create a vibrant economic community? And I feel like sea otters can be a piece of that puzzle for sure. Well, thank you everybody so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.